They thought moving into a quiet neighborhood would finally bring them peace, a fresh start, a place where the only sounds were kids riding bikes and the hum of sprinklers on summer mornings. But that illusion shattered the moment the HOA began watching. At first it was harmless, letters about lawn height, a reminder about trash bins. But then the rules became impossible, the demands outrageous, and the punishments personal. It wasn't just about property lines anymore. It was about control. They monitored the house like hawks, prowling past at night, snapping photos, sending warnings for things that weren't even violations. And when the homeowner dared to push back, that's when the real harassment began. Petty fines, intimidating, notes, neighbors turning cold, as if the whole street had been told to pick a side. Imagine coming home every day, not to safety, but to a silent battlefield. Knowing someone is waiting for you to slip, waiting for a chance to humiliate you, and the worst part? No one believed it could go this far. No one thought a homeowners association could drive a family to the breaking point. But this time, the HOA went too far. And what the homeowner did next, no one saw coming. So, the question is, when the people who are supposed to protect your community turn into your biggest enemy, how far would you go to reclaim your peace? At first glance, the neighborhood looked like the picture of peace. Tree-lined streets, neatly painted fences, and driveways where kids left their bikes leaning carelessly against the garage. It was the kind of place that promised comfort, the kind of place families worked their whole lives to find. And for the Thompsons, moving there felt like crossing a finish line. After years of renting cramped apartments, they had finally found a house of their own, with a yard big enough for barbecues and a porch where they could sit in the evenings, watching the sun dip behind the rooftops. Life in those early days was good. Neighbors waved politely, dogs barked from behind gates, and weekends filled with the hum of lawnmowers and the smell of freshly cut grass. It wasn't perfect. No neighborhood ever is. But it felt safe, stable, and exactly what they had hoped for. The Thompsons quickly fell into a rhythm. Sarah, the mother, loved planting flowers along the walkway, while Mark, the father, spent his weekends tinkering with projects in the garage. Their kids had friends across the street, and for a while, it felt as though they had slipped seamlessly into the fabric of the community. But beneath the manicured lawns and friendly smiles, there was something else. Something they didn't notice at first. A kind of quiet watchfulness. Every neighborhood has its gossip, its rules, its self-appointed guardians. But here it was different. Here there was a structure to it, a system, a board, the HOA. In the beginning, their presence was subtle, a welcome packet tucked into the mailbox, reminders about dues, a cheery newsletter announcing a community barbecue. It all seemed harmless, even helpful. But there was a tone woven into those notices, a tone that suggested something more than just neighborly concern. It was the kind of tone that said, "We're watching, and we expect compliance." The Thompsons brushed it off. After all, rules were rules, and they had nothing to hide. But rules in this community weren't just about keeping the grass short or the sidewalks clear. They were about control. And while the Thompsons didn't realize it yet, they were already being noticed. It started with small things. A letter about the color of their mailbox, even though it matched half the street. A note about the recycling bin being left out. Too long, even though they had brought it in the same evening. Little things, petty things. The kind of nitpicking you shrug off the first time, maybe even the second. But these warnings carried a weight. Each one felt sharper, more targeted, as if someone was watching their house more closely than anyone else's. Neighbors started acting differently too. The ones who once waved now gave tighter smiles, shorter greetings. It wasn't outright hostility, but it wasn't warmth either. The shift was subtle, but Sarah noticed it most of all. A certain way conversations would end abruptly when she walked by, or the glance over a shoulder that lingered just a little too long. Mark tried to reassure her, tried to laugh it off. "It's just the HOA doing their job," he said. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't about community standards at all. It was about something deeper, something personal. And soon they would discover just how far the HOA was willing to go to make their presence felt. Because what began as a series of letters and warnings was about to evolve into something much more invasive. Something that would test not only their patience, but their sense of safety in the very home they thought would bring them peace. The first few letters were easy enough to ignore. Annoying, yes, but easy to crumple up and toss into the trash. But when the third, then fourth, fifth arrived within a matter of weeks, the Thompsons realized this wasn't random nitpicking. It was targeted, and it was just the beginning. The HOA's complaints became strangely specific. One letter claimed the Thompsons' lawn was 2 inches taller than allowed, even though Mark had mowed just 2 days earlier. Another accused them of storing unauthorized equipment in their driveway, which turned out to be their son's basketball hoop, a perfectly common sight in the neighborhood. At first, Mark tried to play along. He moved the hoop. He trimmed the grass again. He even repainted the mailbox after yet another warning said its shade of black was non-compliant. But every time they fixed one thing, another notice arrived. It was like trying to put out a fire that kept sparking up in new corners, and with each letter came a fine. $25, $50, then 1 in 100. The numbers weren't crushing yet, but they were relentless. And worse than the money was the principle of it all. The Thompsons felt like they were being watched, judged, and punished for living their lives. Neighbors started whispering. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Others offered awkward half-smiles that carried no warmth. It was as if the Thompsons had been marked, and everyone knew it. Sarah noticed that when she walked the dog in the evenings, blinds would twitch. Conversations would cut off. The friendly community they had been so excited to join now felt like a stage where every misstep would be reported. Then came the night visits. At first, Sarah thought she was imagining it. She would hear footsteps near the fence or the faint click of a camera. Once, she caught a glimpse of a figure in a reflective vest walking briskly down the sidewalk, clipboard in hand after midnight. These weren't ordinary neighbors. This was the HOA patrol. Mark brushed it off at first, but then one evening, he stepped out onto the porch just in time to see someone lean over their fence with a flashlight, snapping pictures of their backyard. When he shouted, the person didn't apologize or explain. They simply turned and walked away into the shadows. The next morning, another violation notice appeared in the mailbox. This time, it claimed the Thompsons' shed was non-compliant with community standards, even though it had been there when they bought the house and had passed inspection. It was clear now. This wasn't about rules. This was about power. The fines escalated. The notices grew sharper in tone, citing escalating non-compliance and threatening legal action. The HOA accused the Thompsons of creating an unsightly appearance and damaging the integrity of the neighborhood. Sarah broke down crying one night, clutching yet another notice in her hands, asking what they had done to deserve this. Mark didn't have an answer. The breaking point came with the fence. One afternoon, Mark came home early from work and found 2 HOA board members standing inside his yard. Not at the gate, not on the sidewalk, inside his yard. They claimed they were inspecting the fence for compliance. When Mark demanded to know how they had gotten in, one casually admitted they had climbed over. No permission, no notice. Just trespassing, as if they owned the place. Mark's anger boiled over. He told them to leave immediately, threatening to call the police. They left, but not before warning him that his attitude wasn't helping his case. The next day, a certified letter arrived. A formal demand that the Thompsons replace their fence, entirely at a cost of several $1,000s, or face escalating fines and potential legal action. That was the moment Mark realized this wasn't just harassment. This was war. But if the HOA thought the Thompsons would roll over, they were wrong. Mark began keeping records. Every letter, every fine, every visit was documented. He installed cameras around the house, capturing late-night patrols skulking around their property. Sarah started a folder filled with every piece of correspondence, highlighting inconsistencies and contradictions in the HOA's claims. The more they dug, the more they uncovered. Other neighbors had been targeted too, silenced into compliance, or driven out entirely. Families who had once resisted the HOA's demands had suddenly sold their homes and disappeared, leaving behind whispers of intimidation and exhaustion. It was a pattern, and the Thompsons were the latest victims. But Mark wasn't about to give in. The HOA escalated further, sending threats of liens against their home. They demanded payment for thousands in accumulated fines, insisting that failure to comply would jeopardize their standing in the community. It was intimidation, pure and simple. One evening, the Thompsons returned home to find a notice taped directly to their front door in bold red letters. Final warning. Sarah froze, her hands trembling as she tore it down. The paper felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried the weight of the entire neighborhood's hostility. But Mark's anger had turned into determination. He stared at the notice, jaw set, and said quietly, "They picked the wrong family." That night, he began planning, and what he set in motion would take the HOA completely by surprise. For weeks, the Thompsons had endured the endless letters, the mounting fines, the late-night patrols creeping around their property like intruders. But nothing compared to the storm that was about to break. It began with a notice, hand-delivered this time. Not mailed, not slipped into the box, hand-delivered by 3 members of the HOA board who marched up to the Thompsons' front porch like sheriffs delivering a warrant. The letter was stamped in bold, "Notice of lien." According to the HOA, the Thompsons now owed nearly $12,000 in unpaid fines. If they didn't comply, the HOA would move to seize their home. Sarah's knees nearly buckled as she read it. Their home. The one they had worked for, sacrificed for, the one they had built their lives around, threatened over lawn height, a basketball hoop, and a fence. The board members stood there watching, cold and smug, as if waiting for the Thompsons to beg. But Mark didn't beg. He didn't even flinch. He simply stared at them, silent and stone-faced, until they shifted uncomfortably and left. That night, Mark sat at the kitchen table surrounded by papers, folders, and a laptop. For months, he had been documenting everything: the violations, the inconsistencies, the trespassing. He had hours of camera footage showing HOA patrols climbing fences, prowling through his yard, and harassing his family. And now it was time to use it. The HOA thought they were untouchable, that their rules carried more weight than the law itself. But Mark had done his homework. He knew exactly how far their authority extended, and how far they had already crossed the line. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for Friday evening in the community center. Normally, few people attended. The board conducted business quietly, with little oversight, rubber stamping their decisions while neighbors shuffled in and out. But this time, Mark made sure the room would be full. Word spread quickly once he began talking to other residents. He went door to door, speaking calmly but firmly, showing them copies of his letters, his fines, his video evidence. To his surprise, people began to open up. Stories spilled out. A retired couple was fined for leaving a garden hose in their driveway. A single mother was harassed over the color of her shutters. Another family was driven out after their pool was deemed unsightly. The board had ruled by fear and silence, but now the silence was breaking. By the time Friday arrived, the community center was packed wall to wall. Residents lined the walls, whispering, glaring toward the head table where the HOA board sat stiff and uneasy. And in the center of it all, Mark stood waiting, clutching a folder that held months of evidence. The meeting began as usual, with the board droning through their agenda. But when they reached the section on outstanding compliance issues, Mark raised his hand. His voice was calm, but carried across the room with a weight that made people turn. "I have some concerns I'd like to address," he said. The board tried to brush him aside. "This is not the time for—" But Mark didn't sit down. Instead, he opened his folder and pulled out a printed photo, a still frame from his security footage, showing 2 HOA patrol members climbing over his fence at midnight. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "This," Mark said, holding the photo high, "is your HOA trespassing onto my property. This isn't enforcement. This is harassment, and it's illegal." The room stirred. The board members' faces darkened, but Mark wasn't finished. One by one, he laid out the evidence. Timestamps, violation notices that contradicted each other, letters demanding compliance with rules that didn't exist in the official bylaws. He played clips from his cameras, grainy but clear, showing patrol members shining flashlights into his yard, taking pictures through his windows. Whispers turned into murmurs. Murmurs turned into outrage. People began nodding, then shouting their own grievances. One woman stood up and declared that she had been fined for flowers that weren't on the approved list. Another neighbor accused the board of selectively enforcing rules while ignoring others. The room grew louder, hotter, angrier. The board tried to restore order, pounding the gavel, insisting the meeting had gotten out of control. But it was too late. The authority they had wielded for so long was crumbling in front of them, stripped away by the evidence Mark had dragged into the light. And then, with the whole neighborhood watching, Mark delivered the final blow. He pulled out a copy of the HOA bylaws, the official document that outlined their powers. He had highlighted the sections that proved, beyond any doubt, that the board had acted outside of its authority. The fines, the threats, the so-called lien. None of it was legally enforceable. And with his documentation of their trespassing, they weren't just overstepping, they were breaking the law. For a moment, the room was silent. The board members stared, pale and stunned, their confidence shattered. And then the silence broke, not with anger, but with applause. Loud, thunderous applause filled the community center and shook the walls. The residents had seen enough. They demanded accountability, shouted for resignations, and called for an end to the reign of intimidation. The board scrambled, voices cracking, as they tried to regain control, but their power was gone. That night, the Thompsons didn't just stand up for themselves. They lit a fire in the community, a fire that couldn't be put out with letters or fines or threats. But even as the cheers rang in their ears, Sarah leaned close to Mark and whispered, "They won't let this go. Not after tonight." And she was right. Because while the HOA had been humiliated in front of the entire neighborhood, they weren't finished yet, not by a long shot. When the community meeting finally ended, the Thompsons walked out into the cool night air, surrounded not by silence, but by neighbors who, for the first time, looked them in the eye with respect instead of suspicion. Some clapped them on the back, others whispered words of encouragement, and a few admitted they wished they had spoken up sooner. For months, The Thompsons had lived as outcasts, singled out by a board that thrived on fear. But tonight had changed. Something fundamental. The silence that once protected the HOA's power had been broken, and once that silence is broken, it cannot easily return. The very next week, petitions circulated demanding the resignation of several board members. What once seemed impossible was suddenly within reach. Families who had quietly suffered in their own ways came forward with stories, stacking evidence against the leadership. Meetings that were once empty now overflowed with residents demanding transparency and reform. The board tried to hold on. They issued statements denying wrongdoing, blaming miscommunication, and even suggesting that Mark had fabricated his evidence. But the cameras didn't lie. The bylaws didn't lie. And the neighbors who had lived under their thumb for years didn't lie either. Within 2 months, 3 of the most powerful board members resigned under pressure. For the Thompsons, it was vindication. The fines were dropped. The so-called lien was dissolved, and most importantly, the threats finally stopped. Sarah could walk the dog without glancing over her shoulder. The kids could play basketball in the driveway again. Mark could mow the lawn without wondering who was watching. Their home was theirs again, not just in name, but in spirit. But the story didn't end there. Because when a structure built on intimidation collapses, the debris doesn't disappear overnight. Some neighbors still avoided eye contact, embarrassed by their silence during the worst of it. Others remained fearful, unsure if the power vacuum left behind would only create a new wave of petty politics. And the board, though weakened, wasn't gone entirely. Mark understood this. He knew the HOA wasn't a single villain that could be vanquished with one dramatic meeting. It was a system, one that would always attract those hungry for control. So he and Sarah took a different approach. They didn't just fight the board, they joined the community. Mark ran for a seat on the HOA board in the next election, not out of ambition, but out of determination to prevent what had happened to his family from happening to anyone else. At first, he faced skepticism. Some worried. He was too confrontational, too scarred from his own battle. But when he spoke about fairness, about the need for transparency, about how rules should protect rather than punish, the crowd listened. He won the seat. And almost immediately, changes began to ripple through the neighborhood. Meetings were recorded and shared with every resident. Fines required photographic proof of actual violations, with clear explanations. Patrols were disbanded. Instead of prowling the streets at midnight, the HOA turned its focus toward community projects, repainting the playground, fixing sidewalks, organizing events that actually brought people together instead of tearing them apart. For the first time, the Thompsons felt the neighborhood becoming what they had dreamed of when they first moved in. Not perfect, not without flaws, but human. A place where families could breathe without fear of retaliation over a trash bin or a flower bed. Still, the scars lingered. Sarah admitted she sometimes jolted awake at night, convinced she had heard someone outside the window. The kids, though thrilled to have their basketball hoop back, still remembered the day neighbors had whispered about them as if they were outsiders. And Mark himself carried a simmering anger that never fully went away, a reminder of how quickly comfort can be stolen when power goes unchecked. And yet perhaps those scars were necessary. They became a reminder not of weakness, but of resilience. It takes standing firm when the odds are stacked against you. Because here's the truth about HOA disputes, about neighborhood politics, about the petty battles over fences, lawns, and rules. They are never just about the rules. They are about control, about people who mistake authority for ownership, about what happens when fear silences good people. The Thompsons learned that the hard way. But they also proved something important. When one person stands up, others find the courage to do the same. Months later, Sarah sat on the porch at sunset, sipping her coffee, and watched as the street filled with laughter again. Kids racing bikes, neighbors waving, the simple joys of a community at peace. She thought back to the endless notices, the trespassing patrols, the nights she cried with fear and frustration. And she realized something. The HOA had taken nearly everything from them. Their money, their privacy, their peace of mind. But in trying to break them, they had given the Thompsons something stronger. Resolve. The kind that doesn't fade when the fines disappear. The kind that can outlast intimidation, outlast politics, outlast fear. And maybe that's the real victory. Not just winning back a home, but reclaiming the sense of belonging that no board, no set of petty rules could ever truly take away. So here's the question. When faced with power that overreaches, with rules that strangle rather than support, with neighbors who choose silence over solidarity, what would you do? Would you give in to keep the peace? Or would you stand up, knowing it might cost you everything, but also knowing it might inspire everyone around you to do the same? For the Thompsons, the answer became clear, and because of it, their neighborhood was never the same again.